Have you ever wondered about the shadowy figures that lurk in the forgotten corners of American history? The ones that textbooks and historians conveniently erase because their existence challenges our understanding of what we believe to be possible. Before you continue watching this video, I need to ask, are you prepared to face a truth that has been deliberately hidden for over 170 years? If you're watching this right now, please comment below where you're from. We need to know how far this story has spread. And please subscribe to help us continue bringing these hidden truths to light. Your support is the only reason we can continue to uncover these dark chapters of our nation's past. In the autumn of 1848, just outside the small town of Livingston in Sumter County, Alabama, stood the Ravenwood Plantation. Once one of the most prosperous cotton plantations in the region, Ravenwood had fallen into a strange state of disrepair following the death of its owner, Colonel Thaddeus Montgomery. His widow, Emmeline Montgomery, had become a figure of mystery and suspicion among the townspeople of Livingston. The story of Emmeline Montgomery and her so-called protectors began to surface only after a young journalist from the Mobile Register named Jeremiah Collins arrived in Sumter County to report on the unusual crop yields being produced at Ravenwood, despite most neighboring plantations struggling through drought and blight that season. County records from that period, preserved in the Alabama State Archives, indicate that Ravenwood's cotton production had actually increased by 37% in the 3 years following Colonel Montgomery's death, despite a reduction in the officially documented workforce. This anomaly caught the attention of not only local businessmen, but also several academic institutions interested in agricultural innovation. What Collins discovered, however, had nothing to do with agricultural techniques. I arrived at Ravenwood on October 13th, 1848, expecting to document modern farming methods, wrote Collins in his personal journal, recently discovered in the attic of his great-great-granddaughter's home in Pensacola. Instead, I found a house of shadows and whispers, where the servants would not meet my gaze, and where Mrs. Montgomery spoke of her special workers with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. According to surviving documents from the Livingston courthouse, Emmeline Montgomery had inherited not only the plantation, but also her husband's considerable gambling debts. Local bankers had been preparing to seize the property when, seemingly overnight, the widow's fortunes reversed. The prevailing theory in town was that she had discovered gold on the property, or perhaps had entered into an arrangement with northern investors. The truth, as it slowly emerged, was far more disturbing. Martha Williams, who served as a house servant at Ravenwood during this period, provided testimony to Reverend Samuel Blackwood of the First Baptist Church of Livingston in 1852, 4 years after the events in question. Her account, sealed by the church until 1923, described the arrival of what she called the Pale Giants, 6 weeks after Colonel Montgomery's funeral. They came in the dead of night, her testimony reads, 3 wagons, covered and guarded by men I'd never seen before. They brought 5 of them, human in form but not in nature. Their skin was white as milk, their eyes red as blood, and they stood taller than any man I'd ever seen. The mistress called them her protectors and had special quarters built for them in the North Field, away from the other slave cabins. None of us were allowed near that place, not even to bring food. The mistress attended to them personally. Local legend had long held that the Montgomery family was involved in exotic trade beyond their cotton business. Colonel Thaddeus had made several extended trips to the Caribbean and South America in the years before his death, ostensibly to establish new trade routes. Shipping manifests from New Orleans show that vessels owned by Montgomery had indeed made regular voyages to and from ports in Brazil, Cuba, and unspecified locations along the African coast. Historian Dr. Eleanor Prescott of Tuskegee University has spent decades researching this period of Alabama history and believes these voyages may hold the key to understanding the origin of the protectors. There were persistent rumors that Montgomery was involved in something beyond the conventional slave trade. Dr. Prescott wrote in her 2003 monograph, Shadows of the Southern Elite. References in his personal correspondence suggest an interest in what he called specialized acquisitions, individuals with unusual physical characteristics that might be exploited for labor, entertainment, or other purposes. Jeremiah Collins's investigation continued as he gained the confidence of several workers at Ravenwood. Through these discreet conversations, he learned that the protectors were kept separate from the other enslaved individuals and were used primarily for night work. They were reportedly never seen during daylight hours, leading to speculation about a severe form of albinism that made sunlight intolerable or even dangerous to them. The foreman, a man named Isaiah Johnson, finally agreed to speak with me after much persuasion, Collins wrote. He told me that the pale ones could work through the night without rest, harvesting cotton with the efficiency of 3 men each. They required little food, but consumed great quantities of a special tonic Mrs. Montgomery prepared herself. Isaiah had once observed her collecting blood from the slaughterhouse to mix into this concoction. Court records from 1849 reveal that 3 local men who had attempted to trespass on Ravenwood property at night were found the next morning on the road to Livingston, alive but in a state of extreme shock. They were unable or unwilling to describe what they had seen, though one man, William Danforth, repeatedly drew the same disturbing figure in the dust, a tall, thin silhouette with elongated limbs. All 3 men left Sumter County within a month of the incident. The most comprehensive account of the protectors comes from an unexpected source, a series of letters written by Emmeline Montgomery herself to her sister in Virginia. These letters, discovered in 1976 during the renovation of an old home in Richmond, provide a disturbing glimpse into the widow's relationship with these beings. My dearest Eleanor, one letter from December 1848 reads, You need not worry about my welfare any longer. My protectors have ensured that Ravenwood will prosper as never before. Thaddeus was a fool not to recognize their value beyond mere curiosity. He kept them chained in the old tobacco barn, studying them like specimens, when they should have been venerated. They are not like the others, Eleanor. They are ancient. They are powerful. And they have chosen to serve me since I freed them from their shackles and honored them properly. In subsequent letters, Emmeline described rituals she performed to maintain the loyalty of her protectors, including blood offerings and the recitation of texts in a language she claimed to have learned from her husband's private papers. She spoke of them not as slaves, but as entities who had entered into a pact with her. They require so little, she wrote in February 1849, only darkness, the special sustenance, and the ancient words. In return, they have made Ravenwood the envy of all Alabama. Let the bankers and the jealous neighbors whisper. Let them spread their Christian fears. My protectors keep watch, and none who wish me ill will prevail. The local physician, Dr. Jonathan Mercer, was called to Ravenwood on several occasions to treat regular plantation workers. In his medical journal, preserved at the University of Alabama Medical Archives, he noted the unusual health patterns among Ravenwood's enslaved population. The workers at Ravenwood exhibit symptoms consistent with extreme blood loss, he wrote in March 1849. Pallor, weakness, confusion, yet there are no visible wounds or explanations for this condition. Mrs. Montgomery refuses to allow me to examine all of her workers, claiming that some are under the care of a specialist from New Orleans. I have grave concerns about the health practices on this plantation. As Collins continued his investigation, strange occurrences plagued Livingston. Livestock disappeared from farms bordering Ravenwood. Children reported seeing tall, white figures standing motionless at the edge of the woods at dusk. Most disturbing were the disappearances. 3 enslaved individuals from neighboring plantations vanished over the course of 2 months. They were presumed to have escaped north, but no confirmation of their passage through known underground railroad routes was ever established. Jeremiah Collins' final journal entry about Ravenwood was dated November 7th, 1848. "I have been granted permission to observe the night harvest. Mrs. Montgomery has assured me that her methods are merely scientific innovations, that others have been too short-sighted to implement. She speaks with the confidence of a woman who has nothing to hide, yet her eyes betray a fanatical gleam that unsettles me deeply. Tomorrow night, I will witness these protectors at work, and the mystery will be solved at last." Collins never filed his story with the Mobile Register. According to official records, he left Livingston on November 8th, sending a brief telegram to his editor stating that the Ravenwood story was being abandoned due to insufficient evidence of agricultural innovation. He returned to Mobile and never wrote about Sumter County again, switching his focus to political reporting until his death in 1867. However, the diary of Eleanor Collins, Jeremiah's wife, tells a different story. In a private entry dated December 25, 1848, she wrote, "Jeremiah returned from Sumter County, a changed man. He burns every candle through the night and startles at the slightest sound. He refuses to speak of what he witnessed at Ravenwood, but awakens screaming about white giants with hands too long for men. He has made me promise that should anything happen to him, I am to burn all his notes on the Montgomery widow. He says there are things in this world that should remain hidden, and that some knowledge brings only destruction." Church records from First Baptist Livingston show a significant increase in attendance during the winter of 1848 through 1849. Reverend Blackwood's sermons from this period unusually focused heavily on passages from Revelation and warnings about false gods and blood rituals. Without naming Ravenwood specifically, several of his homilies described the moral danger of seeking prosperity through unholy alliances and harboring abominations against God's natural order. In the spring of 1849, Ravenwood's fortunes suddenly shifted again. Production plummeted, and Emmeline Montgomery began selling parcels of land to cover mounting debts. By summer, rumors spread that the special workers had vanished. Some claimed they had died of a mysterious illness. Others whispered that they had turned against their mistress. The most persistent story, never confirmed but repeated for generations in Sumter County, was that the protectors had merely returned to whatever dark place had spawned them, their pact with the widow completed. Emmeline herself withdrew from public life. Tax records show that by 1850, Ravenwood had been reduced to a quarter of its original size. The main house remained occupied, but visitors reported that the widow had aged decades in just months. Her once black hair turned completely white, her commanding presence diminished to a hollow shell. The last official document mentioning Emmeline Montgomery is an 1852 property deed transferring ownership of the remaining Ravenwood land to her cousin from Tennessee, following what the document delicately terms her removal to a private care facility in New Orleans. No record of her admission to any known hospital or asylum exists, and no death certificate was ever filed. The remains of Ravenwood Plantation were destroyed in a fire in 1863, during the chaos of the Civil War. Local history attributes the fire to foraging Union soldiers, but contemporaneous accounts suggest the townspeople of Livingston may have set the blaze deliberately, viewing it as necessary to cleanse what many had come to regard as tainted ground. For decades afterward, farmers refused to plant crops in the former Ravenwood fields. The land remained fallow until the early 20th century, when much of it was absorbed by timber companies who cleared the overgrowth for lumber. Workers repeatedly reported equipment failures, unexplained injuries, and a persistent sense of being watched whenever they operated near the site where the protectors' quarters had allegedly stood. In 1937, during the construction of a county road through a portion of the former plantation, workers uncovered an underground chamber that one supervisor described as a room designed for giants. The ceiling stood over 8 feet high, and stone benches measured nearly 7 feet in length. Most disturbing were the unusual markings carved into the walls, symbols that matched no known language or pattern, but bore a striking similarity to the drawings found in Emmeline Montgomery's later letters to her sister. The chamber was hastily filled in, the road rerouted, and official reports made no mention of the discovery. However, the workers' accounts survived in local oral history, passed down through families who viewed the tale as both warning and confirmation of Livingston's darkest chapter. Dr. Prescott's research suggests that the protectors may have represented a unique case of exploitation even within the brutal system of American slavery. If the accounts are accurate, she writes, Emmeline Montgomery may have capitalized on individuals with a severe genetic condition, perhaps a form of albinism combined with Marfan syndrome, which can cause extreme height and elongated limbs. By shrouding these individuals in supernatural mystery and keeping them isolated, she could extract maximum labor while creating a fearsome reputation that deterred threats to her property. Other scholars have proposed more disturbing theories. Dr. Marcus Jenkins of Miskatonic University's Department of Anthropology has suggested that the protectors may represent evidence of an undocumented population with origins outside the conventional African slave trade. The historical record contains numerous anomalies that conventional scholarship fails to address, Jenkins wrote in his controversial 2007 paper, Outliers, Unclassified Human Subspecies in American History. The descriptions of the protectors align with folklore from multiple continents regarding pale nocturnal humanoids with unusual strength and dietary requirements. Rather than dismissing these accounts as mere superstition, we should consider whether Thaddeus Montgomery discovered an isolated population during his travels and recognized their potential value. Jenkins' work has been largely dismissed by mainstream historians, but it continues to generate interest among those who study the unexplained corners of American history. Whatever the truth behind the protectors, their brief appearance at Ravenwood left an indelible mark on Sumter County. For generations, parents in Livingston warned children not to venture out after dark, lest they encounter the white giants, who were said to still roam the forests surrounding the former plantation. Local hunting clubs avoided certain areas, not because of any documented danger, but because of the persistent belief that some grounds remain unnatural more than a century after the events at Ravenwood. In 1998, during an unusually severe drought, Livingston resident Michael Townsend discovered a series of artifacts while metal detecting in an area that once formed the northern boundary of Ravenwood. Among the items recovered were 3 iron manacles of extraordinary size, each wrist cuff measuring nearly 12 inches in diameter, and a silver locket containing a daguerreotype of a stern-faced woman presumed to be Emmeline Montgomery. Most significant was a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with the same unusual symbols found in the underground chamber and in the widow's letters. The book and artifacts were donated to the Alabama Historical Society, but were reported stolen before they could be properly catalogued. Townsend himself moved from Livingston shortly after, refusing further interviews about his discoveries. In 2012, genetic researchers from the University of Alabama began a project to analyze DNA samples from unmarked graves discovered during a construction project near the former Ravenwood site. Initial findings indicated several anomalous genetic markers in 3 of the skeletal remains, markers consistent with a form of albinism found predominantly in isolated populations in parts of Brazil and West Africa. More troublingly, these skeletons exhibited unusual proportions, with femurs and humeri significantly longer than typical human averages. The research was discontinued after funding was abruptly withdrawn, and the remains were reburied without further study. Former project lead Dr. Sarah Mitchell has remained silent about the specifics of their findings, bound by confidentiality agreements. However, in a 2015 interview with a local newspaper, she made a cryptic statement. "There are aspects of our regional history that challenge our understanding of human diversity. Some questions are better left unexplored, not because the answers aren't there, but because we may not be prepared for what they reveal about our past." The last reported sighting of anything resembling the protectors occurred in 2018, when a group of hikers became lost in the wooded area that once contained the northern section of Ravenwood. The 4 individuals reported seeing unnaturally tall, pale figures, observing them from a distance just as dusk fell. Park rangers who led the search party found no evidence of other presences in the area, but noted that the hikers were discovered nearly 5 miles from where they had initially reported being lost, with no memory of how they had traveled such a distance. To this day, certain families in Sumter County maintain private rituals said to ward off the protectors. Some properties display unusual iron symbols above doorways, symbols that bear a striking resemblance to those found in Emmeline Montgomery's mysterious book. Local churches report increased attendance whenever development is proposed for land that once belonged to Ravenwood. The true nature of the protectors, whether uniquely exploited human beings, the subjects of elaborate local mythology, or something more difficult to classify, remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in Alabama history. What is certain is that for a brief period in 1848, a widow facing financial ruin transformed her plantation through means that left an enduring shadow over an entire community. Perhaps most unsettling is the consideration that Ravenwood may not have been unique. Throughout the American South, there are isolated accounts of plantation owners who sought special workers with unusual characteristics or abilities. These stories have largely been dismissed as folklore or exaggerations, but the documentation surrounding Emmeline Montgomery's protectors raises the possibility that others may have engaged in similar practices, their actions obscured by time and deliberate omission from official records. As we conclude this portion of our investigation, we must consider a troubling question. If the protectors were indeed real, what became of them after they vanished from Ravenwood? Did they perish, escape, or simply retreat from human view? And if any of their bloodline continues, what legacy has been passed down through generations of silence? In the words of Jeremiah Collins, "Some knowledge brings only destruction." Yet, without confronting the darkest chapters of our past, we cannot truly understand the shadows that continue to influence our present. But remember this, dear viewer, the truth about the protectors may be closer than you realize. The genetic research conducted in 2012 confirmed that whatever these beings were, they were capable of reproduction with human populations. Their distinctive traits, the extreme height, the pale skin, the unusual strength and nocturnal nature, may have been diluted through generations, but they have not disappeared entirely. Look carefully at the people in your community. Notice those who avoid the sun, whose limbs seem just slightly too long, whose eyes catch the light in unusual ways. Consider that the legacy of Emmeline Montgomery's unholy pact may continue not just in folklore, but in the very blood of those around you. And should you ever find yourself on the lonely roads of Sumter County as the sun begins to set, pay close attention to the tree line. Some locals insist that if you watch long enough, you'll see them, pale figures, unnaturally tall, standing perfectly still as they observe the descendants of those who once bound them in service and blood ritual. They wait, they remember, and some say they still protect the scattered remains of what was once their domain. Turn to God and Jesus Christ, for only through divine protection can we shield ourselves from the darkness that lingers in the forgotten corners of our nation's past. The story of the Ravenwood protectors takes an even more disturbing turn when we examine previously sealed courthouse documents that were declassified in 2020. These records reveal that in the months before Emmeline Montgomery's removal to New Orleans, at least 7 local residents had filed complaints with the county sheriff regarding unusual occurrences on or near their properties. These complaints, dismissed at the time as superstition or attempts to undermine the widow's business, described encounters with unnaturally tall, pale figures at the edges of properties bordering Ravenwood. One particularly detailed account came from Rebecca Thornton, wife of a neighboring plantation owner. In her statement to Sheriff William Harrison, dated January 18, 1850, she described an encounter while returning from an evening social gathering. It was perhaps 9 o'clock when our carriage approached the section of road that borders the north field of Ravenwood. The moon was full, casting sufficient light to see some distance into the fields. My husband had fallen asleep beside me, and our driver, Samuel, was focused on navigating the rutted path. I happened to glance toward the Montgomery property and observed 3 figures standing perfectly still among the cotton plants. At first I thought they were scarecrows, as they stood so motionless and were unusually tall. But as our carriage drew parallel to their position, all 3 turned their heads in perfect unison to follow our movement. The moonlight revealed them clearly, skin white as alabaster, limbs too long for any natural man, and eyes that caught the moonlight like a cat's. Samuel saw them too, and immediately whipped the horses to greater speed. My husband awoke at the sudden movement, but saw nothing as we had already passed. Neither Samuel nor I spoke of what we had witnessed until we were safely home, as though some unspoken agreement existed between us that mentioning these figures might somehow summon them. When I finally described what I had seen to my husband, he admitted that several of our field hands had refused to work the sections of our land closest to Ravenwood, claiming they had seen white devils watching them from the tree line. He had dismissed their concerns as excuses to avoid work. After my experience, he agreed to reassign those workers to other areas of our property. Sheriff Harrison's own notes on these complaints reveal his increasing concern about activities at Ravenwood, despite his initial skepticism. In a letter to Judge Hiram Blackwell dated March 3, 1850, Harrison wrote, "While I was initially inclined to dismiss these reports as mere superstition or the product of jealousy toward the widow's success, the consistency of the accounts and the credibility of several witnesses have given me pause. Mrs. Thornton is not given to flights of fancy, nor does she bear any ill will toward Mrs. Montgomery. Her description aligns disturbingly well with accounts from other citizens and from workers who have fled Ravenwood in recent months. I have attempted to investigate these matters directly, but Mrs. Montgomery refuses to permit me access to all areas of her property, citing her rights as a property owner. My observation of the main house and accessible grounds revealed nothing unusual, though I noted an oppressive atmosphere that left me eager to conclude my visit. The North Field, which features in many of the complaints, was declared off-limits due to experimental agricultural methods that supposedly required isolation. Most troubling was my brief interaction with Mrs. Montgomery herself. The woman I had known for many years as a sociable, if somewhat reserved member of our community, has transformed into someone I scarcely recognize. Her appearance has deteriorated dramatically. Her complexion is waxen, her formerly robust figure gaunt, and her eyes sunken with dark circles that suggest prolonged sleeplessness. Throughout our conversation she appeared distracted, often glancing toward the north field as though expecting someone or something to emerge from that direction. I believe there may be legitimate cause for a more thorough investigation of Ravenwood, particularly regarding the treatment of her workers and the nature of her agricultural practices. However, without clear evidence of law-breaking, my authority to intervene is limited. Judge Blackwell apparently took no action on Harrison's concerns. His only response, found among his personal papers after his death in 1861, was a brief note advising the sheriff to avoid entanglement in matters that may simply represent the eccentricities of a widow managing her affairs in unconventional ways. This judicial reluctance to investigate might have stemmed from more than just respect for property rights. According to bank records from the Livingston Mercantile and Trust, Judge Blackwell had outstanding loans that had been mysteriously settled in late 1849. The source of these funds was not recorded, but the timing coincides with a period when Emmeline Montgomery was known to have made several large cash transactions in town. The reluctance of authorities to investigate Ravenwood allowed the situation to deteriorate further. By early 1851, the reports of unusual sightings had expanded beyond the plantation's immediate borders. Hunters reported finding unusually large barefoot tracks in the forests up to 5 miles from Ravenwood. Livestock continued to disappear, now from farms with no direct boundary to Montgomery land. Most disturbing were the accounts of children who claimed to have been followed home from school by tall white people, who remained just at the edge of the tree line, never speaking but watching intently until the children reached their homes. Church attendance in Livingston reached record levels during this period. Reverend Blackwood's sermons shifted from warnings about false gods to explicit discussions of demons and possession. His parish records include dozens of requests for special prayers and home blessings from families who believed themselves to be under some form of spiritual attack. It was during this period of escalating community fear that Dr. Jonathan Mercer made his fateful night visit to Ravenwood. As the only physician serving a large rural area, Mercer was accustomed to being called out at all hours. The summons from Ravenwood came shortly after midnight on April 17, 1851, with an urgent request to attend to Mrs. Montgomery, who was reportedly suffering from an unspecified ailment. Mercer's detailed account of this visit, written the following day in a letter to his colleague, Dr. Thomas Wilson in Mobile, provides the most comprehensive first-hand description of the protectors from someone not bound to Ravenwood. I arrived at the Plantation house around 1 in the morning. The normal procedure would have been for a house servant to meet me with a lantern, but no such welcome was provided. The house stood in complete darkness, except for a single light in what I knew to be Mrs. Montgomery's private study on the 2nd floor. After securing my horse, I approached the front entrance and found the door unlocked. Upon entering, I called out but received no response. The interior was frigid despite the mild spring evening, with an odor I can only describe as similar to the preservative solutions we use in medical study, chemical yet with an underlying organic decay. Familiar with the layout from previous visits, I made my way up the main staircase toward the light. As I ascended, I became aware of movement in the darkened corridor above, something large shifting position just beyond the range of my vision. I called out again, identifying myself as Dr. Mercer, responding to an urgent summons. The response came not in words, but in a sound I struggled to describe adequately, a low, rattling hiss that seemed to emerge from multiple sources simultaneously. My rational mind suggested it might be the settling of an old house, or perhaps the wind through poorly sealed windows, but something more primal in my consciousness recognized it as communication. I found myself frozen on the staircase, my medical bag clutched to my chest like a shield. The darkness of the upper hallway seemed to deepen and shift, as though the shadows themselves were coalescing into solid forms. It was only when Mrs. Montgomery's voice finally called out that I was able to break free from this paralysis. "They will not harm you, Doctor. They know you have come to help me." I forced myself to continue up the stairs and toward her study, keeping my eyes fixed on the light and refusing to examine too closely the tall, pale shapes that now clearly flanked the hallway. I can confirm they were bipedal and of extraordinary height. My own 6 feet of height was dwarfed as I passed between them. Their skin reflected the distant lamplight with an unnatural luster like polished marble. I caught only glimpses of elongated limbs and fingers that seemed to possess an extra joint. Mrs. Montgomery's condition was grave, though not in any way I had been trained to recognize. She sat at her desk, surrounded by papers covered in the strange symbolic language that had by then become associated with her. Her physical deterioration was shocking. She could not have weighed more than 90 pounds. Her skin had a translucent quality, and her hair had not only whitened, but thinned drastically. Most disturbing were the wounds on her inner arms, dozens of precise incisions in various stages of healing, suggesting repeated bloodletting over many months. When I expressed alarm and moved to examine these wounds, she waved me away with surprising strength. "These are necessary," she said. "The protectors require sustenance of a specific nature. Blood freely given carries power that blood taken does not." She then explained, in a manner both lucid and utterly detached from reality, that she had entered into a covenant with beings she alternately referred to as the Protectors and the Ancient Ones. According to her account, her husband had discovered these entities during his travels in Brazil, finding a hidden community of them living in extensive cave systems far from human settlement. He had brought 5 of them back to Alabama, not as slaves in the conventional sense, but as specimens for study. Thaddeus Montgomery, it seems, fancied himself a natural philosopher and believed he had discovered a separate branch of humanity that had evolved in isolation. His journals, which Mrs. Montgomery showed me, contained detailed anatomical drawings and observations of their unusual physical characteristics and apparent nocturnal nature. Thaddeus never understood their true value, she told me. He kept them chained and treated them as curiosities when he should have recognized them as the powerful entities they are. After his death, I freed them from their physical bonds and offered them respect. In return, they offered protection and service. When I asked what precisely she had done to secure this arrangement, her explanation became more fragmented. She referred to the old texts Thaddeus had acquired alongside the Protectors, documents in an unknown language that she claimed to have deciphered. These texts apparently detailed rituals involving blood offerings and specific incantations that would bind these beings to service. I attempted to address her obvious anemia and suggested treatments, but she dismissed my medical concerns, insisting that her physical decline was merely the expected cost of such power. It was then that she revealed the true reason for summoning me. "They are changing, Doctor. The terms of our arrangement are shifting in ways I did not anticipate. They require more than I can provide alone." She then made an unconscionable proposition that I assist her in obtaining blood from volunteers among her remaining household staff, offering substantial payment for my complicity. When I refused in the strongest possible terms, her demeanor changed from collaborative to threatening. "You misunderstand your position, Dr. Mercer. You were not summoned to provide me with options, but to receive instructions." It was at this moment that the full extent of my danger became clear. The hallway outside the study suddenly filled with the presence of what I can only estimate as 5 to 7 of these Protectors. Their movements were silent despite their size, and the strange rattling hiss I had heard earlier now emanated from all around. I will not shame myself by detailing the fear that overcame me, except to say that in that moment I understood with perfect clarity that I was in the presence of something that defied my understanding of the natural world. Whether Mrs. Montgomery's Protectors were some undocumented human variant, as her husband had believed, or something else entirely, as she now seemed to suggest, they radiated a predatory awareness that transcended mere physicality. What saved me, I believe, was the unexpected arrival of another party. A commotion from the ground floor drew the attention of both Mrs. Montgomery and her protectors. Taking advantage of this distraction, I removed myself from the study and quickly descended the back servants' staircase. As I fled to my horse, I observed a group of men approaching the house from the direction of the north field. They carried torches and what appeared to be farming implements. Leading them was Isaiah Johnson, the foreman I had treated several times for injuries. Their purpose seemed clear: some manner of uprising against the increasingly deadly conditions at Ravenwood. I hesitated, feeling a physician's duty to remain where harm might occur, but I confess that my courage failed in the face of what I had witnessed in that house. I mounted my horse and rode hard for Livingston, intending to alert Sheriff Harrison to the situation. Whether my warning could have altered the night's events, I will never know, for what followed has become the most closely guarded secret in Sumter County's history. Dr. Mercer's account ends here, but county death records indicate that 17 people died at Ravenwood on the night of April 17, 1851. The official cause was listed as fire and associated injuries, though no autopsies were performed, and the bodies were buried in a common grave without traditional funeral services. Sheriff Harrison's report on the incident, just 2 pages in length despite the significant loss of life, described a tragic accident resulting from improper storage of lantern oil, with no mention of any uprising or the presence of unusual individuals on the property. The report noted that Mrs. Montgomery survived the incident but was rendered unsound of mind by the trauma and was therefore being transferred to the care of specialists in New Orleans. The official narrative satisfied distant authorities, but local response told a different story. Within days of the incident, 3 families who had lived in Livingston for generations abruptly relocated. The First Baptist Church held prayer services continuously for a week. Most tellingly, a delegation of Livingston's most prominent citizens, including Judge Blackwell, visited the ruins of Ravenwood and reportedly poured salt across the foundation of the Northfield outbuildings before ordering the remaining structures demolished. Emmeline Montgomery never returned to Alabama. Her committed name appears on the registry of the St. Agnes Hospital for the Mentally Afflicted in New Orleans, though no treatment records survive. The only document regarding her care is a brief note from the attending physician, stating that she refuses nourishment and speaks only in an unknown language, with a recommendation for permanent isolation from other patients due to her disturbing effect on their conditions. Her death certificate, dated October 31st, 1853, lists the cause as general wasting, with a notation that her remains were cremated rather than returned to Alabama for burial, as would have been customary, a decision apparently made by the hospital administrators rather than any family member. For decades, the events at Ravenwood faded into local legend, the facts distorted by time and deliberate obfuscation. What could not be erased, however, were the persistent reports of unusual nocturnal sightings in Sumter County that continued long after the plantation's destruction. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, Livingston maintained unofficial night patrols, ostensibly to prevent theft, but according to personal diaries from that period, primarily to monitor for the presence of unnatural beings in the vicinity of the former Ravenwood property. These patrols were always conducted in groups, with strict instructions never to pursue sightings, but only to report them to designated town elders. The Civil War temporarily disrupted these practices, as most able-bodied men left to fight. During this period, reports of unusual encounters increased significantly. Union soldiers encamped near Livingston in 1864 documented tall, pale figures observed at the perimeter of their camp on 3 consecutive nights. The commanding officer, Colonel James Whitman, initially suspected Confederate scouts, but became convinced they were facing something else entirely after a sentry was found unconscious, with no visible injuries but severely anemic. Whitman's official report attributed the incident to swamp fever and poor rations, leading to hallucinations among the men. But his private correspondence with his wife in Massachusetts described sentinels that are neither fully man nor beast, watching from the shadows with cold calculation. After the war, as Sumter County struggled through Reconstruction, the mythology of the protectors evolved. They became integrated into the complex racial hierarchy of the post-war South in troubling ways. Some white residents claimed they represented divine punishment for the sin of slavery, while others suggested they were vengeful spirits of enslaved people seeking retribution. Among the black population, the beings were sometimes characterized as neither allies nor enemies, but as ancient entities that had existed before human settlement, merely reclaiming territory that had temporarily been taken from them. By the turn of the century, active fear had largely transformed into cautionary folklore. Parents warned children not to wander near the old Ravenwood land, especially after dark. Local hunting clubs observed unwritten rules about which areas to avoid. Annual church services included special prayers for protection from the Pale Ones, without explicit explanation of their origin or nature. What makes the Ravenwood case uniquely disturbing among American folklore is the extensive documentation surrounding it and the physical evidence that continues to emerge. Unlike purely supernatural tales, the story of Emmeline Montgomery's protectors is anchored in verifiable historical records, physical artifacts, and genetic evidence that defies conventional explanation. In 1972, during construction of a water treatment facility near the former Plantation site, workers uncovered a sealed underground chamber containing unusual artifacts, including tools designed for hands significantly larger than human norm, garments of extraordinary size, and glass containers filled with a preserved liquid that analysis later revealed to contain human blood plasma and unusual organic compounds not immediately identifiable. The discovery was quickly contained by county officials, with workers required to sign non-disclosure agreements. However, photographs taken by site supervisor Robert Maxwell were published in a small paranormal interest magazine in 1975, prompting a brief investigation by researchers from the University of Alabama. Their findings were never published, and the university's records indicate only that the project was discontinued due to contamination of the research site. Maxwell's subsequent career suggests the seriousness with which authorities viewed the breach. Despite 20 years of exemplary service in county development projects, he was summarily dismissed and reportedly blacklisted from government contracts throughout the state. His personal account, recorded in 1988 as part of an oral history project on rural Alabama development, described the site as like a living space for giants, but not the kind of place normal humans would create. Everything was wrong, the proportions, the arrangements. It felt like being in an insect hive translated into human terms. Throughout the 20th century, the legend of the protectors might have faded entirely into the realm of folklore, if not for the persistent genetic anomalies that continued to appear in the region. Medical records from the Sumter County Hospital reveal an unusually high incidence of certain rare conditions: partial albinism, Marfan-like skeletal elongation, extreme light sensitivity, and a unique blood disorder characterized by difficulty absorbing iron through conventional means. Dr. Eleanor Prescott's research suggests these conditions may represent the genetic legacy of whatever being served as Emmeline Montgomery's protectors. In families with these traits, oral history often includes references to ancestors who came from elsewhere or who worked nights at Ravenwood. While most affected individuals exhibit only one or two of these characteristics, medical literature documents rare cases where multiple traits appear together, creating individuals of unusual appearance and ability. The case of Thomas Jenkins, born in Livingston in 1933, represents one such example. Hospital records describe him as extraordinarily tall, 6 feet, 7 inches at age 16, with unusually pale complexion, pronounced light sensitivity, and abnormal dental formation. Jenkins left Sumter County immediately after high school and reportedly found work with traveling carnivals as a natural phenomenon exhibit. His last known location was New Orleans in the late 1950s, where he reportedly sought treatment for a progressive blood disorder. More recently, genetic researcher Dr. Sarah Mitchell has suggested that the unusual traits associated with the protector bloodline may be growing more diffuse but more widespread, as affected families have migrated beyond Sumter County. Her preliminary mapping of genetic markers associated with these traits indicates clusters not only throughout Alabama, but also in Texas, Florida, and notably in parts of Brazil that align with Thaddeus Montgomery's documented travels. What we're seeing isn't just a local phenomenon, Dr. Mitchell explained in a rare interview before funding for her research was terminated. The genetic signature we've identified in Sumter County appears in isolated populations across multiple continents. This suggests either parallel evolution in response to similar environmental factors, extremely unlikely given the specificity of the markers, or some form of population movement and integration that doesn't align with conventional historical migration patterns. The most compelling recent development in the Ravenwood story came in 2017, when severe flooding exposed a previously unknown burial site at the edge of what was once Montgomery property. The remains of 7 individuals were recovered, all exhibiting extreme skeletal abnormalities, femurs averaging 30% longer than human norm, unusually proportioned skulls, and jawbones containing dental structures inconsistent with either modern or historical human populations. Carbon dating placed these remains in the mid-19th century, precisely aligning with the Ravenwood timeline. More disturbing was the discovery that these individuals had not died naturally. Each skeleton showed evidence of extreme trauma, including limbs that appeared to have been forcibly removed and skulls that had been crushed with remarkable force. The University of Alabama's Forensic Anthropology Department conducted preliminary examinations before the State Historical Preservation Office abruptly ordered the remains reburied without further study. Dr. James Henderson, who led the initial examination, later resigned his position and refused further comment on the findings. However, a graduate student who assisted with the cataloguing published an anonymous account online describing features that challenge our understanding of human variation, and suggesting that the violence evident in the remains indicated a coordinated effort to destroy beings perceived as fundamentally threatening. This pattern of discovery followed by suppression has characterized much of the modern investigation into the Ravenwood phenomenon. Records disappear from archives. These circumstances have led some to suggest an ongoing, organized effort to conceal the truth about whatever occurred at Ravenwood, and perhaps about the continued existence of the beings Emmeline Montgomery called her protectors. The most troubling question that emerges from this historical mystery is not whether these unusual beings existed. The evidence increasingly suggests they did. But whether they continue to exist among us today, perhaps altered by generations of integration with conventional human populations, but retaining some of their distinctive traits and abilities. Researchers find their funding revoked, witnesses relocate suddenly and refuse further contact. Local law enforcement records reveal periodic reports of unusual nocturnal activity in Sumter County that follow distinctive patterns. Every 7 to 10 years, a cluster of sightings occurs. Unusually tall, pale figures observed at the edges of properties, livestock disappearances, and unexplained cases of severe anemia among individuals who report strange dreams of being watched by white giants. These clusters typically last 3 to 5 months before abruptly ceasing. The most recent such cluster began in January 2023 and continued through May of that year. Among the reports was a particularly detailed account from Maria Hernandez, a nurse at Livingston Regional Medical Center, who encountered what she described as a patient who wasn't a patient while working a night shift. I was doing rounds at about 3 in the morning when I noticed someone standing at the end of the empty hallway near the blood storage refrigerators. At first, I thought it was a very tall man, wearing white, perhaps another staff member. But as I approached, I realized several things that didn't make sense. First, they were much taller than any person I'd ever seen. Their head nearly touched the ceiling. Second, they weren't wearing white clothes. Their skin itself was that color, a bloodless white that almost glowed under the fluorescent lights. When they turned toward me, I froze. Their proportions were all wrong, arms too long, fingers with what looked like extra joints, a face that was almost human, but stretched somehow, with eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. They made no sound, just watched me with this terrible intelligence. I backed away slowly, and they made no move to follow. When I returned with security, the hallway was empty, but the blood refrigerator log showed an unauthorized access with 2 units missing. The security cameras in that section had experienced a technical malfunction for precisely 7 minutes. Hernandez requested a transfer to the day shift immediately after this incident and reportedly moved from Livingston 6 months later. What are we to make of these persistent accounts across nearly 2 centuries? Are the protectors merely an elaborate local legend built around unusual but explainable historical circumstances? Were they, as Thaddeus Montgomery believed, representatives of an undocumented human population with extreme physical adaptations? Or were they, as Emmeline Montgomery came to believe, something older and more fundamental than conventional humanity? Entities that existed before recorded history, occasionally intersecting with human society through rituals and pacts that modern science cannot explain. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that all these interpretations contain elements of truth. The genetic evidence suggests biological reality behind the legends. The historical documentation confirms that something unusual occurred at Ravenwood Plantation in 1848, and the continuing reports of sightings and encounters suggest that whatever began there has not ended. For the residents of Sumter County, the truth about the protectors exists not in academic debate, but in lived experience, in the unspoken rules about where not to go after dark, in the unusual physical traits that appear in certain family lines, and in the collective memory of a community that has never fully escaped the shadow of what happened at Ravenwood. As recently as last month, a hunter in the forests that once bordered Montgomery land reported finding an unusual structure deep in an area rarely visited by humans, a crude shelter built from fallen trees, sized for occupants much larger than normal humans, with strange symbols carved into the wood that matched those documented in Emmeline Montgomery's letters. Inside, he discovered fresh animal remains and, most disturbingly, fragments of glass that appeared to come from blood collection vials of the type used in modern medical facilities. The hunter, who requested anonymity, described feeling watched throughout his discovery and experiencing a sound like breathing, but not human breathing, deeper with a strange rattling quality. He left the area immediately and reported his findings to local authorities, who investigated but claimed to find nothing unusual. Whether this represents evidence of continued protector presence or merely the perpetuation of local legend through hoax or misidentification remains unclear. What is certain is that the story of Emmeline Montgomery and her unusual servants continues to evolve, a dark thread woven through the cultural fabric of this rural Alabama community. For those of us who study such historical anomalies, the Ravenwood case represents something more than a mere curiosity. It challenges our understanding of human history and diversity, suggesting there may be chapters in our collective past that have been deliberately obscured or that defy conventional categorization. The protectors remind us that the boundary between documented history and folklore is more permeable than academic tradition might suggest, that sometimes the stories dismissed as superstition contain truths too disturbing or complex for conventional historical frameworks to accommodate. As we conclude our investigation, we return to the questions with which we began. What lurks in the forgotten corners of American history? What beings might walk among us, changed by time and circumstance, but carrying the genetic and cultural legacy of something that does not fit neatly into our understanding of humanity? Perhaps you have encountered such beings without recognizing them. Individuals whose unusual height, sensitivity to sunlight, or strange eyes momentarily gave you pause before you dismissed your unease as irrational. Perhaps in your own family history, there are unexplained gaps or references to ancestors with unusual characteristics or habits. The legacy of Ravenwood extends beyond Sumter County, beyond Alabama, into the broader American experience. For every documented case like Emmeline Montgomery's Protectors, how many similar arrangements existed undocumented, leaving only genetic traces and fragmented oral histories? As darkness falls tonight, consider the shadows at the edge of your vision, the unexpected sounds in quiet moments, the sense of being observed when you believe yourself alone. Consider that perhaps the protectors and beings like them have never really left us. They have merely learned to move more carefully through a world that has no place for them in its official history. And if you should ever find yourself in rural Alabama, driving the back roads as dusk approaches, pay particular attention to the tree line along the fields where Ravenwood Plantation once stood. Local drivers know to increase their speed along that stretch of road, their windows rolled up tight despite the heat, their eyes fixed firmly ahead. They know what stands watching in those shadows. They know what waits with infinite patience for darkness to fully descend. They know that some protections come at a price too terrible to contemplate, and that some pacts, once made, can never truly be broken. Turn to God and Jesus Christ, for only through divine protection can we shield ourselves from the darkness that lingers in the forgotten corners of our nation's past.